You do not have an independent personality. You are not naturally low maintenance. You are not simply a chill or easygoing person. What you actually have is a highly adapted nervous system. This nervous system experienced chronic emotional starvation early in development. It performed a brutal mathematical calculation during your formative years. It determined that expressing a personal need yielded zero external return. Therefore, verbalizing distress became a useless expenditure of caloric energy. Your brain actively disabled the physical impulse to ask for help. Your perceived chillness is absolutely not a moral virtue. It is an involuntary state of deep neurological resignation. You are not at peace. You have simply stopped expecting anyone to respond. Watch closely how this manifests at a standard family dinner. Your sibling sits across the table loudly complaining about a minor work inconvenience. Instantly, the physical dynamics in the room shift. Both of your parents lean forward. Their vocal pitch rises. They offer rapid solutions and soothing tones. Your hand slips. You accidentally drop your metal fork onto the ceramic plate. It clatters loudly. The sound cuts directly through the conversation. Your entire musculoskeletal system instantly freezes. Your eyes dart upward. Not a single person looks your way. The conversation does not pause for even a fraction of a second. Instead of speaking, you silently bend down. You pick the fork up off the floor. You meticulously wipe it with a paper napkin. You resume chewing your food in complete silence. But here is the brutal physical reality. Your diaphragm stops moving. Your breathing shifts rapidly to shallow, upper chest respiration. Your heart rate does not spike. It actually drops significantly. This is a textbook parasympathetic shutdown response. Your autonomic nervous system is bracing for impact. It is preparing your physical body for the deeply familiar reality of your own total irrelevance. The actual fatal mechanism goes far deeper than just being ignored. Why does being the good, quiet kid actively rot your baseline capacity for joy? And how does your brain systematically erase your own identity to ensure your survival in a household that exclusively rewards chaos? Emotional invisibility is not a passive state. You are not simply being ignored by the people around you. It is an active, metabolically expensive neurological adaptation. Your brain is reacting to a severely constrained environment. The absolutely scarce resource in this environment is parental attention. Your nervous system treats this scarcity exactly like a physical famine. It forcibly alters your biology to survive the drought. A child makes a biological bid for emotional connection. The caregiver responds with a flat affect or total distraction. The child's brain instantly registers a critical failure in the primary attachment figure. This failure triggers an immediate and severe stress response. Cortisol aggressively floods the bloodstream, but repeated relational rejection guarantees chronic cortisol spikes. This constant chemical flooding leads directly to dangerous adrenal fatigue. To prevent total biological burnout, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis physically intervenes. The HPA axis forcibly down, regulates its own baseline sensitivity. It actively mutes your physiological response to your own internal needs. You stop feeling the sharp pain of neglect because your brain permanently severed the alarm wire. The actual fatal mechanism lies deeper in your reward circuitry. The nucleus accumbens normally releases dopamine when you express your authentic self. In the undervalued sibling, the brain learns this chemical equation is broken. Self-expression no longer triggers any neurochemical reward. The entire dopamine pathway is aggressively and permanently rerouted. Your brain now strictly rations dopamine exclusively for utility. You only receive a neurochemical reward for solving an external problem. You get a dopamine hit for remaining completely invisible. You are chemically rewarded for stabilizing the chaotic elements of your household. Your biological capacity for joy is now completely tethered to your usefulness. Watch closely how this physical reality plays out. A 10-year-old child achieves a perfect score on a highly difficult math exam. They walk eagerly into the kitchen, holding the graded paper. They see their mother intensely rubbing her temples. She is visibly stressed over the other sibling's recent disciplinary issue. The 10-year-old physically stops dead in the doorway. Their pupil dilation instantly and measurably shifts. The biological marker of reward, anticipation, completely vanishes. It is immediately replaced by rapid, autonomic threat, scanning. They silently take a slow step backward. They place the perfect test face down in the plastic recycling bin. They walk quietly to the wooden cabinet. They pour a glass of cold tap water. They place the glass silently next to the mother's right hand. They leave the room without making a single sound. And it gets worse. This repetition creates a complete neurological decoupling. Your internal desires are physically severed from your external expression. You lose the actual physiological neural pathway required to recognize your own wants. You cannot articulate a simple preference because the biological hardware is completely offline. This forces your nervous system into a state of chronic, low-grade anhedonia. The permanent baseline of your adult existence becomes a flat, grey numbness, but the physical brain cannot permanently delete basic human needs. It merely outsources the processing power to other regions. The undervalued child is structurally transformed. They are mutated into a highly sophisticated, deeply pathological threat. Detection machine. Your legendary emotional intelligence is absolutely not a moral triumph. You are not simply highly empathetic or naturally deeply compassionate. This entire behavioral profile is a hyper-vigilant survival strategy. It was systematically hammered into your biology by the terror of chronic unpredictability. You learned early that an unmonitored emotional shift in a caregiver meant danger. Anticipating their needs became a life-or-death biological imperative. Your ability to constantly hold space for others is actually a trauma response. The actual fatal mechanism is hidden deep within your brain's default mode network. In a healthy brain, this network allows for normal baseline daydreaming and self-reflection. In the undervalued sibling, the DMN is violently hyperactivated. It runs constant, exhausting, high-definition simulations of other people's internal mental states. This is a clinical phenomenon known as theory of mind overdrive. Your brain is burning massive amounts of glucose to predict the exact mood of unpredictable caregivers. It calculates the precise atmospheric pressure of the room in real time. This evolutionary mechanism was the only way you could maintain a fragile environmental equilibrium. If you could predict the psychological explosion, you could physically maneuver to avoid the shrapnel. But here is the brutal physical reality of how your body executes this mirroring. According to Polyvagal Theory, your nervous system is trapped in a chronic fawning state. This is a highly unstable blended state of ventral vagal social engagement and pure sympathetic arousal. You are simultaneously smiling and heavily flooded with adrenaline. To flawlessly regulate the emotional state of the dominant person in the room, you must make a biological sacrifice. You must actively and aggressively suppress your own visceral, somatic signals. This means actively shutting down your interoception. You physically stop feeling your own hunger, physical exhaustion, or sharp pain. Your autonomic nervous system completely mutes your own biology. It does this to maximize your sensory bandwidth for monitoring others. Watch closely how this plays out in a standard corporate meeting. A think reviewing segment accuracy. I am now carefully revisiting the segmented text to ensure the JSON adheres to the instructions. I am focusing on validating the output and making minor adjustments to the word count. If necessary, each segment appears to meet the constraints. Think senior colleague, sitting next to you, sighs heavily. They shift their physical weight aggressively in their leather chair. Instantly, your hand physically stops moving across your notepad. Your own autonomic breathing rhythm immediately alters. Your lungs begin expanding and contracting to exactly match the respiratory rate of your colleague. Without ever being explicitly asked, you physically lean forward. You verbally offer to take over their most tedious, frustrating project. But look at the unseen physical reality beneath the wooden conference table. The masseter muscles in your jaw clench, together with bone-crushing force. Your smooth muscle tissue paralyzes. Your entire digestive motility completely halts. Your autonomic nervous system aggressively prioritizes mitigating the external tension. It completely overrides the biological reality of your own severe workload. The inevitable consequence is that you physically become an emotional landfill. Your physical body bears the entire physiological load of these unexpressed internal needs. This repressed biological stress physically manifests in severe somatic symptoms during adulthood. Your joints ache with unexplained, crushing chronic fatigue. Your immune system becomes fundamentally confused and triggers violent autoimmune flare-ups. You experience chronic, crippling gastrointestinal distress with absolutely no obvious medical cause. And it gets worse. This relentless outward focus forcibly creates a terrifying internal vacuum. Because you have completely erased your own internal signals, you leave a massive void. This makes the adult individual a highly attuned biological magnet. You actively attract a very specific, deeply predatory type of relational dynamic. You do not seek love that is actually good for you. Your brain actively rejects healthy reciprocity. You strictly seek out love that your nervous system physically recognizes. Your biological baseline was calibrated in an environment of severe emotional starvation. Therefore, your adult brain unconsciously constructs relationships that perfectly replicate this exact deficit. You are not unlucky in your romantic choices. Your nervous system is executing a highly precise, deeply pathological pattern, matching algorithm. It scans a room of potential partners and immediately identifies the most familiar threat. It actively selects the exact person who will require you to completely erase yourself. The actual fatal mechanism is driven by basic Hebbian learning. Neurons that physically fire together permanently wire together. During your childhood, the concept of love was repeatedly paired with profound emotional neglect. Your brain physically hardwired the sensation of attachment to the act of being entirely useful to someone who ignores your inner world. This neural pathway becomes thick, fast, and incredibly efficient over decades of repetition. Now, watch what happens when you are finally presented with healthy, reciprocal affection. A partner actually asks about your feelings and waits for an answer. This unfamiliar stimulus completely bypasses your logic centers. It strikes your amygdala as a terrifying, unpredictable anomaly. Your amygdala immediately fires intense danger signals. Your body interprets this safe intimacy as severe, skin-crawling anxiety. You mislabel this biological panic as simply feeling bored by a nice person. But here is the brutal physical reality of your cognitive filtering. Your brain operates on the strict, unforgiving mechanics of self-verification theory. Human beings possess an overwhelming biological drive to have the external world mirror their internal schema. Your deeply ingrained neurological schema dictates that your feelings are entirely secondary. Your prefrontal cortex operates as a ruthless, subconscious bouncer. It actively filters out any partner who attempts to prioritize your well-being. It identifies them as cognitively dissonant and therefore highly physically uncomfortable. Instead, it aggressively locks onto partners who demand constant, exhaustive emotional management. By selecting these emotional black holes, your brain successfully validates its original programming. You physically engineer your own neglect to prove your traumatized nervous system was right all along. Watch closely how they react on a standard Friday night date. The partner sits across the wooden table. The partner spends 45 uninterrupted minutes loudly venting about an ex-partner. They fail to ask a single question about the undervalued individual sitting right in front of them. The individual physically leans in across the table. They begin nodding their head in a continuous rhythmic motion. A sharp, hot tightness rapidly expands in the center of their own chest. They actively suppress this physical sensation by intentionally taking shallow breaths. They begin mechanically dispensing highly validating, therapeutic statements. Finally, the partner pauses, takes a drink, and casually asks how their week was. Instantly, the individual's vocal pitch drops a full octave. They physically snap their neck away and completely break eye contact. They stare blankly at their own hands resting on the cold table. They quietly say they are fine and have absolutely nothing much to report. Without pausing for a single breath, they immediately ask a highly specific follow-up question about the partner's ex. They forcefully deflect the dangerous spotlight back onto the familiar chaos. The physiological toll of this endless deflection is catastrophic. You begin to incubate a highly toxic, deeply repressed state of delayed anger. This is a slow-burning, autoimmune, like psychological resentment. It is completely blocked from targeting the actual perpetrator, because expressing anger externally is biologically coded as dangerous. The anger physically turns inward. It aggressively attacks your own cellular structure. This internalized rage violently manifests as severe, paralyzing imposter syndrome. You experience a chronic daily state of brutal self-invalidation, and it gets worse. Eventually, the sheer biological exhaustion of managing everyone else's nervous system permanently shatters this adaptation. You are abruptly left staring into a terrifying vacuum where your own identity was supposed to be. Without an external crisis to actively manage, you practically cease to exist. Without a chaotic room to read, your brain loses its primary survival function. Without a broken person to physically stabilize, your nervous system idles in a dangerous void. You do not possess a robust, independent sense of self. Your biological systems evolved solely to process the dysregulation of others. When the physical space around you is completely empty, your nervous system lacks a subject to process. The actual fatal mechanism is rooted in how human memory physically consolidates. A cohesive identity requires external validation during critical developmental windows. A child experiences a visceral physiological shift, and a caregiver verbally narrates that experience back to them. This deliberate neurological interaction physically builds the architecture of episodic memory, because your internal states were completely ignored. This specific brain structure never fully developed. Your brain aggressively recorded objective facts and semantic data to ensure your survival, but it entirely failed to encode self-referential, autobiographical memories. You remember the exact physical layout of your childhood home. You remember the precise decibel level of your mother's anger, but you cannot physically recall how those specific events made you feel in your own body. Your brain simply did not install the neurological hardware required to record your own existence. And it gets worse. This chronic decades-long suppression of emotion physically alters your brain connectivity. You develop a severe clinical condition known as acquired Alexithymia. You completely lose the biological ability to identify emotions generating within your own tissue. The medial prefrontal cortex is the specific brain region responsible for self-reflection. Over time, this region physically severs its neural pathways to the limbic system. The physical communication bridge between your logical thoughts and your raw somatic feelings completely collapses. When someone directly asks you who you are, your brain physically stalls. It frantically searches for the correct data pathway to generate an accurate answer, but the structural wiring simply does not exist. You are left scanning a dead neural network for a signal that was permanently disconnected. Watch closely how this physical reality violently manifests on a completely quiet Sunday afternoon. There are absolutely no physical chores left to execute in the apartment. There are 0 unread text messages from erratic friends currently in crisis. There are no urgent, demanding emails from your corporate employer. The individual sits stiffly on the edge of their grey fabric sofa. Their resting heart rate steadily and uncontrollably begins to climb. Their fingers mechanically open and close 3 different applications on their phone. Their eyes do not actually process a single pixel of data on the glowing screen. A distinct physical sensation of cold, hollow dread forms directly in their solar plexus. The absolute silence of the room rapidly amplifies the deafening physiological noise of their own existence. They abruptly stand up, their leg muscles rigid with untethered adrenaline. They forcefully grab chemical cleaning supplies from under the kitchen sink. They begin aggressively and obsessively scrubbing a stovetop that is already perfectly clean. But here is the brutal physical reality of this autonomic coping mechanism. You cannot outwork this internal vacuum indefinitely. This biological avoidance inevitably triggers a profound, catastrophic existential collapse. This structural failure usually detonates in your early 30s or 40s. It hits with the terrifying, paralyzing realization that you have survived your environment flawlessly, but you have absolutely zero connection to the biological organism you successfully kept alive. You maintained the physical heart rate and respiration of the body, but the neurological core of your actual identity never formed. Here is the cold, unvarnished truth about your existence. Attention was never a mathematical metric of your actual human worth. It was merely a raw measurement of the squeakiness of the wheel next to you. Your chronic invisibility was never an accurate appraisal of your intrinsic value. It was a direct, physical symptom of your family's severe emotional poverty. They simply lacked the neurological capacity to process more than one crisis at a time. You have been patiently waiting decades for a verbal apology. You are starving for a single moment of retrospective recognition. But here is the brutal physical reality. It is biologically impossible for them to give you that closure. Their brains lack the structural self-awareness required to retroactively process their neglect. You were never inherently unlovable or fundamentally defective. You were simply a collateral casualty of deeply flawed emotional logistics. The actual fatal mechanism can only be broken through forced biological exposure. You must manually override your highly conditioned autonomic nervous system. The next time someone casually asks you for a favor that oversteps your physical capacity, you will absolutely not say that you need to think about it. Your brain knows that phrase is just a delayed, highly anxious. Yes, you will look directly at them and say, no, you cannot do that. And then you will force your musculoskeletal system to sit perfectly still for 90 seconds. You will actively allow your resting heart rate to violently pound against your ribs. You will allow the eccrine glands in your palms to aggressively sweat. You will endure the agonizing, burning surge of cortisol flooding your bloodstream. You will physically restrain your jaw from rushing to apologize. You will not explain your reasoning or attempt to fix the crushing silence in the room. You will explicitly treat your own psychological guilt as a chemical withdrawal symptom. Your body is simply detoxing from the highly addictive drug of lifelong compliance. If you are finally ready to stop merely surviving your environment, if you are ready to aggressively dismantle the psychological architecture holding your biology hostage, subscribe to this channel. We absolutely do not manufacture comfortable illusions here. We strictly dissect cold, neurological reality. See you in the next breakdown.